Chapter 73. No Law, No Morality. We can, with the greatest clarity, say, no God, no morality. Matthew Arnold was foolish enough to believe that God could be dropped from the minds of men, but morality retained. In recent years, the validity of Christian morality has been openly challenged. The ethical standard of humanism is against any universally valid morality. The, quote, values clarification, end quote, courses taught in many state schools insist on every person's, quote-unquote, right to create their own personal and private morality. Objections to teaching chastity in state school, quote-unquote, family courses are at times openly based on the fact that chastity is an emphasis on biblical morality. Humanism demands freedom for a variety of sexual expressions. According to 1 John 3:4, quote, whosoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law, for sin is the transgression of the law, end quote. Antinomianism, by denying the law, denies thereby the reality of sin. Sin is the transgression of the law of God. If there is no law, there is then no sin. But this is not all. If there is no sin, there is no need for atonement. As evangelicalism has become increasingly antinomian, it has also steadily lost the meaning of Christ's atonement. Instead of atonement satisfying the justice of God by the substitution of the sinless incarnate Son of God as our sin-bearer, atonement has become an emotional event. The evangelical churchmen even refer to the cross as, quote, a great mystery, end quote. They can speak emotionally of the shed blood of Jesus without knowing why it was shed, nor why God's law and justice require atonement. This ignorance has had a shattering effect on the life of faith. The atonement is a juridical act and much, much more. In contemporary evangelical thinking, Christ's death on the cross is limited in its meaning to a purely personal application. That such an application is valid is true only if the theological meaning is maintained. If God requires restitution as the basis of man's relationship to himself, and therefore as necessary for man's relationship in society to his fellow men, Exodus 22, then Christ's atonement is central to the justice system, to man's relationship to God, and to man's relationship to his fellow men. Without this centrality of the atonement to all of life, to our relationship to God and to man, we have no justice in any biblical sense. Justice rests on atonement and restitution, and apart from this, religion and society fall into injustice. Those who insist on antinomianism as the valid meaning of the New Testament do not face up to the requirement of Matthew 15:17-20. Those who, quote, break one of these least commandments and shall teach men so shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven, end quote. This does not speak of antinomians, but simply of any who set aside the least commandment and their interpretation thereof. Those, however, who nullify the whole of God's law, like the scribes and Pharisees, quote, shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven, end quote. It is amazing that some men can read this and insist on some alien meaning. How much worse it is when some have actually taught that the law was given by Satan. Almost all these antinomian, quote, Bible teachers, end quote, do stop short of saying that the law's origin was in Satan, but they still treat it as an evil thing too often. In all this, the antinomians are like the humanists who, denying God, deny his law, a logical step. The churchmen who deny the law have in effect denied God also. They forget that the modernists began by challenging and denying the Pentateuch, the Mosaic books, as authentic. The evangelical camp seems to be on the same pilgrimage to unbelief. It's not surprising that the denial of the Mosaic books is commonly followed by an altered view of biblical infallibility. More than a few denominations, seminaries, and colleges that began by breaking away from the mainline churches are soon involved in antinomianism and loose views of the Bible and its authority. After all, to reject God's law means rejecting much of both the Old and New Testaments. It should not surprise us that many antinomian pastors and churches have serious moral problems whose roots are in their antinomianism. This should be no surprise. If a church objects to the use of the Ten Commandments in its services, it will logically reject their application in their personal lives. If there is no law, there is no morality. Of the ungodly, David says, quote, "There is no fear of God before his eyes." Psalm 36:1, a verse cited by Paul in Romans 3:18 in an important context, the description of the ungodly. Romans 3:10-23. It is a mark of evil that this can be said of so many within the church.